You just handed in your notice. 20, 30 years of grinding it out, and you finally said the words, "I'm retiring," out loud to your boss. You've got over $3 million sitting in your IRA and other accounts. Your house is basically paid off. You are, by almost any measure, done. Free. Out. And then you go home to your fiancée, who is still working, who has about $1 million to your $3, who owns a second house in the mountains that's losing money every single month, and who is, by her own admission, not particularly diligent about investing. Here's the question that's actually keeping this guy up at night, and it's not really about money at all, even though it looks like it is. The question is, when two people retire on wildly different timelines with wildly different bank balances, are they actually compatible? Or is one of them just quietly subsidizing the other's golden years? Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand something most couples never figure out until it's way too late. That the gap you're staring at right now is almost never the gap you'll be staring at in 10 years. And that single insight is going to change how you think about money in your own relationship, whether you've got $3 million or $300 in the bank. And look, I want to be upfront about something. This isn't some hypothetical I made up to get views. This is based on a real letter sent to a financial advice columnist. The kind of question real people are wrestling with right now, tonight, lying awake doing math in their heads instead of sleeping. So if any part of this sounds uncomfortably familiar, the uneven bank accounts, the property nobody quite knows what to do with, the quiet resentment that builds when one partner feels like they're carrying more than the other, that's not a coincidence. That's just what modern relationships actually look like once you get past the wedding photos and into the spreadsheets. Hello, I'm Anne. Welcome to my channel. This video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal, tax, or financial advice. Let's get into it. So here's the setup in plain English. This guy is 60. He's retiring with north of $3 million in retirement and taxable accounts, plus a house that's nearly paid off. He's set. His fiancée is 55, still working, still grinding through a job she actually hates. Long commute, evening calls with overseas teams that run until 10 at night. She's got close to $1 million in her 401k and IRAs, another $100,000 sitting in regular savings. And here's the kicker. Even with a 30% pay cut after getting laid off, she still earns slightly more than he does right now. Now, on top of all that, she's got a ski house, a literal second home in a resort town with a $500,000 mortgage on it. And before you picture some glamorous mountain retreat, let me paint the real picture for you, because this is where it gets almost comedic. We're talking 60 feet of snow some years, wildfire risk maintenance, wear and tear from Airbnb guests who treat someone else's vacation home like a frat house. And I am not making this up. Squirrels and mice that have literally chewed through the insulation. So when people hear she owns a ski house, they picture champagne and a hot tub. The reality is property tax bills, snow removal invoices, and rodent damage. That's the gap between what an asset looks like on paper and what it actually costs you in real life. Keep that idea in your back pocket because we're going to come back to it. And it's not a small gap either. Real estate investors who actually track this stuff will tell you that the hidden costs of owning a second home, maintenance, insurance, property management, repairs, typically run somewhere between 1% and 4% of the home's value every single year, just to keep the thing standing. On a $500,000 property, that's potentially $15,000 to $20,000 a year, quietly leaving the bank account before a single dollar of appreciation ever shows up. And that's before you factor in the specific joys of 60 feet of snow and an Airbnb guest leaving the hot tub running overnight. And then there's a third layer to this. She co-owns her mother's house with her brother. The brother's going through a rough divorce, supporting 2 kids who are about to head off to college. So selling that property right now isn't really an option for the family. But here's the thing nobody talks about enough. She's also set to inherit a meaningful chunk of money from her mother in the next 8 to 10 years, which means somewhere out there in her 60s, a financial unlock is coming that could change this entire equation. So you've got one guy who is fully done, mortgage nearly paid off, $3 million in the bank, ready to spend his days doing absolutely nothing stressful. And one woman who is still grinding through a soul-crushing commute, managing a money-losing vacation property, and waiting on an inheritance that's still years away. Here's the thing. When most people look at numbers like this, they make one massive mistake. They compare today's snapshot and assume that's the permanent state of the relationship. 3 million versus 1 million. Done versus not done. Retired versus still grinding. And they panic because it feels lopsided. It feels like one person is going to be the financial safety net for the other forever. But that is not how money works. Money is not a photograph. Money is a movie. And if you only look at frame one, you have no idea how the story ends. So let's actually do the math here, because the math tells a completely different story than the headline does. Let's say she keeps doing what she's already doing, contributing to her 401k, getting an employer match, and her investments grow at something like a 7% average annual return over the stock market, which, by the way, is actually a fairly conservative long-term assumption based on historical S&P 500 performance. Let's also assume both properties, her ski house and her mother's house, appreciate by something modest, say 15% over the next decade. Not aggressive, not banking on some crazy boom, just steady, boring appreciation. Run that forward 10 years, and her investment portfolio alone could grow to somewhere close to $2 million. Add in her share of the property equity from both homes, and you're looking at total assets pushing past $2.7 million. And if she bumps her contributions up, even something like 6% of her salary with a 4.5% employer match, she could be sitting at $3 million in investments alone by the time she's 65. Let that sink in for a second. The gap everyone's worried about right now, 3 million versus 1 million, basically disappears within a decade, just from ordinary, unglamorous, boring compound growth. No lottery ticket, no crypto bet, just time, contributions, and the market doing what markets generally do over long stretches. This is the single most underrated force in personal finance, and it's called compounding. And I genuinely think most people underestimate it because it's invisible in the short term and undeniable in the long term. In year one, 7% growth on $1 million is $70,000. Feels nice, not life-changing. But by year 10, that 7% is compounding on top of every previous year's growth. And suddenly the numbers start moving in chunks that look almost unreal. This is exactly why Einstein, or whoever you want to credit with the quote, historians argue about it, supposedly called compound interest one of the most powerful forces in the universe. Whether he said it or not, the math behind it is absolutely real. Think of it like a snowball rolling down one of those mountains we keep talking about. At the top of the hill, it's basically nothing. A fistful of snow you could crush with one hand. Push it a little ways and it picks up a bit more snow, barely noticeable. But the further it rolls, the bigger the surface area gets, and the faster it accumulates more snow per foot traveled. By the time it reaches the bottom of the hill, it's not a snowball anymore, it's an avalanche. And it got there not because of one dramatic push, but because of hundreds of small, boring rotations nobody was paying attention to. That's exactly what's happening inside her 401k right now, whether she feels it or not. So if you're someone watching this thinking, I make less than my partner, we're never going to be equal, I want you to actually sit down and run your own numbers 10 years out. Not today's numbers, 10 years from now numbers. Because the gap that feels enormous right now might be a rounding error by the time you're both staring at retirement. But, and this is a big but, none of that growth happens automatically. It happens because money keeps getting invested, consistently, year after year, even when it's boring, even when the account balance barely seems to move. The moment you stop contributing, stop investing, and just let cash sit there doing nothing, that whole projection falls apart. Compounding isn't magic, it's momentum, and momentum dies the second you stop feeding it. So now let's talk about the ski house, because honestly, this is where I think the real lesson of this whole story is hiding. On paper, the ski house is an asset. It's worth something. It might appreciate by $200,000 to $300,000 if the area keeps booming, especially with all the demand from remote workers and, weirdly enough, from the AI boom driving up real estate in certain tech-adjacent resort towns. But here's what the spreadsheet doesn't capture: the emotional tax of owning that property. Every time a renter leaves and there's a broken shower or a heat ring burned into a wooden cabinet, that's not just a repair bill. That's a phone call. That's coordinating a contractor. That's the dread of opening your email and seeing urgent, issue with the property. A repair that costs $300 on paper can feel emotionally like it cost $3,000 because of the stress, the back and forth, the constant low hum of anxiety about what's going to break next. There's a term people throw around: passive income, and it gets used for basically anything that isn't a paycheck. But owning a short-term rental in a high-snow, high-wildfire risk, rodent-prone mountain town is about as far from passive as it gets. It is a part-time job that happens to come with property tax bills. And here's the thing nobody puts in the brochure: the financial cost and the psychological cost of an asset are two completely separate ledgers, and most people only ever look at one of them. And here's why that distinction matters so much. Financial stress doesn't actually care whether the number in your bank account is going up or down. It cares about uncertainty. A guaranteed expense of $500 a month feels psychologically way less stressful than an unpredictable expense that might be $50 one month and $3,000 the next, even if the unpredictable one averages out to less money over the year. Our brains are wired to fear the unknown more than they fear the known, even a known that's expensive. That's exactly why owning the ski house feels so much heavier than the spreadsheet says it should. It's not really a $500,000 mortgage that's draining her. It's the constant, low-grade dread of what's it going to be this time. So what should this couple actually do about the ski house? Here's the practical answer, and it applies to basically anyone holding on to a stressful asset, whether it's a vacation property, a side business, or even just a high-maintenance investment portfolio that requires constant attention. First, there's an old real estate rule of thumb that says you generally want to hold a property for at least 5 years before selling, just to have a real shot at recouping your costs or seeing meaningful appreciation. Selling early, especially in a slower market, is basically guaranteed to lock in a loss once you account for closing costs, commissions, and the original purchase premium. So if you're early into owning something like this, patience is usually the financially smarter move, even if it's emotionally exhausting in the meantime. Second, and this is the part most people skip, actually sit down and build a real budget for the property. Not a vague feeling of, this thing costs a lot. An actual list. Separate the recurring costs, property tax, insurance, snow removal contracts, basic utilities, from the one-off costs, like a surprise repair or replacing damaged insulation. Because here's what happens when you don't do this. Every expense feels like a fresh crisis, a fresh annoyance, a fresh argument. But when you can look at a spreadsheet and say, okay, this is a predictable $4,000 a year, and this was a one-time $800 squirrel incident, suddenly the whole thing becomes less emotionally chaotic. You've turned an unpredictable source of dread into a known, budgeted line item. That alone does wonders for how a couple experiences a shared financial burden. Third, if you're going to keep the property and keep renting it out, treat it like the small business it actually is. That means looking at whether your nightly rate and cleaning fees actually reflect what it costs to run the place. A lot of people set a rental price once, years ago, and never touch it again, even as costs creep up around them. Small, regular price increases, even modest ones, compound just like investment returns do. They won't transform the property into a cash cow overnight, but they shift the psychology from, "We are bleeding money on this place," to, "We are running this place profitably, even if it's tight." That mental shift matters more than people think. Fourth, and this one's easy to skip, but it might be the most important. Talk about the worst-case scenario out loud, together, before it happens. Most of the dread around a property like this doesn't come from the actual repairs. It comes from imagining them in the dark, alone, at 11 at night, wondering what happens if the roof goes or a pipe bursts in February under 6 feet of snow. Couples who sit down and actually agree in advance on a plan, if it's under $1,000, we just handle it. If it's over that, we talk first, and here's the emergency fund we're keeping specifically for this house. Take almost all of the emotional sting out of the inevitable bad text message from the property manager. The repair still costs money. It just stops feeling like a crisis every single time. Now here's where I want to zoom out, because the ski house isn't really the point of this story. It's a stand-in for every should we sell it or should we keep it decision that couples argue about. A timeshare, an old car neither of you uses, a business one partner started and the other partner resents. The financial question is almost always secondary to the real question, which is the stress of holding on to this thing worth more or less than the financial upside of keeping it? And that brings us to the actual relationship question buried in all of this. Are these two people compatible financially? Here's my honest take. The raw numbers, 3 million versus 1 million, look scary if you stop the clock today. But money isn't a snapshot, it's a trajectory. And her trajectory, even by conservative assumptions, is heading towards something very close to his. She's earning more than him right now, even after a pay cut. She's going to inherit a meaningful sum within the decade. Her retirement accounts, if she keeps contributing, are on track to roughly double or more within 10 years, just from compounding growth. The gap isn't a permanent gap, it's a timing gap. And timing gaps are actually one of the most common, most misunderstood sources of friction in long-term relationships, because they get mistaken for fairness gaps. One partner finishes school later and starts saving later. One partner takes a few years off to raise kids and re-enters the workforce behind where they'd otherwise be. One partner inherits money in their 30s, another inherits it in their 60s. None of that is a measure of who's more responsible or who's trying harder. It's just sequencing. But if you only ever look at the current balance and never ask, where is this heading? Sequencing gets misread as a character flaw, and that's where resentment quietly starts to build. What actually determines whether two people are financially compatible isn't whether their account balances match on the day they get engaged. It's whether they're being honest with each other about the full picture. Debts, properties, inheritances, spending habits, the whole mess of it. And whether they're willing to plan together instead of just quietly worrying separately. This guy retiring at 60 isn't doing his fiancée a favor by silently footing the household bills while she works through a miserable job. He's doing them both a favor by sitting down, running actual projections like the ones we just walked through, and showing her in black and white that she is closer to financial freedom than her day-to-day stress is letting her believe. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a stressed-out partner isn't reassurance, it's math. Cold, specific, here's what the numbers actually say, math. And honestly, that's the move I'd want every single one of you watching this to make in your own life. Whether you're in a relationship or flying solo, stop comparing your current balance to someone else's current balance and panicking. Pull up a calculator, plug in your actual contributions, your actual employer match, a reasonable long-term growth rate, and project it out 10 years. I promise you, almost everyone is shocked by what compounding quietly does in the background while you're busy stressing about today's number. If there's a ski house in your life, something that's technically an asset but is quietly draining your energy and your bank account every single month, don't make an emotional decision about it today. Build the actual budget. Separate the recurring costs from the one-time disasters. Decide, with real numbers in front of you, whether the stress is worth the appreciation, instead of letting dread make the decision for you by default. And if you're in a relationship where one of you has more right now than the other, do the unsexy thing. Sit down together. Look at the real 10-year picture, not just today's snapshot. Because 9 times out of 10, the gap that feels like it's going to define your entire relationship is actually just a temporary difference in timing. And the couples who figure that out early are the ones who stop fighting about money and start actually planning with it. That's it for this one. If this kind of real talk money breakdown is useful to you, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, because we're doing a lot more of these, and trust me, the next one's going to mess with how you think about money just as much as this one did.